Imagine lying on a wooden table in the middle of a bloody battlefield tent. The air reeks of gunpowder, sweat, and infection. Around you, groans of soldiers echo as their limbs are sawed off without anesthesia, without sterilization, without even washing the tools between patients. This was the medical reality of the American Civil War. And what doctors did during that conflict wasn't just insane by modern standards. It was often deadly. Stay with me, because as we uncover the shocking, bloody, and bizarre practices of Civil War medicine, you'll all see why so many soldiers feared the surgeon's tent more than the enemy's bullets. Quick question before we dive in. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. And hey, if you're fascinated by history's darkest secrets, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because you don't want to miss what's coming next. The Civil War, fought between 1861 and 1865, wasn't just one of America's bloodiest wars. It was also one of the most medically devastating. More than 620,000 soldiers died during the conflict. And what's shocking is that 2/3 of those deaths didn't come from bullets or bayonets. They came from disease, infection, and medical treatments that often killed more than they cured. So, what made Civil War medicine so brutal? Let's start with the battlefield surgeons, the men many soldiers dreaded more than Confederate cannons. Picture this: a canvas tent set up just behind the lines. Inside, piles of bloody bandages, severed limbs stacked like firewood outside the door, and surgeons moving from one wounded soldier to the next with barely a pause. The Civil War produced mass casualties on a scale America had never seen before. Battles like Antietam and Gettysburg left tens of thousands wounded in just hours. The medical system simply wasn't prepared. Surgeons had almost no formal training. In fact, many doctors had never treated a gunshot wound before the war. Most had studied basic anatomy, maybe apprenticed under another physician, but they had no experience handling mass trauma. Worse, they didn't understand the most basic principle of modern medicine: germ theory. Bacteria and infection were not widely accepted until after the work of Louis Pasteur in the 1860s, which meant that Civil War surgeons saw no need to sterilize their tools. That's right, the same bone saw used to amputate one soldier's leg would be immediately used on the next patient without cleaning. Blood, pus, and fragments of bone often clung to instruments as they cut through skin and muscle again and again. One of the most infamous aspects of Civil War medicine was the staggering number of amputations. Roughly 60,000 amputations were performed during the war. Why? Because Civil War weaponry was far deadlier than doctors were prepared for. Muskets had given way to rifled bullets, especially the mini ball. Unlike round musket balls, mini balls shattered bones and shredded tissue. When a soldier was hit in the arm or leg, the bone would often splinter beyond repair. Surgeons faced a choice: try to save the limb with primitive techniques and risk deadly infection, or amputate quickly and give the soldier a chance at survival. So, amputation became the go-to treatment, and it was done with terrifying speed. Surgeons could saw through flesh, muscle, and bone in just a few minutes. In fact, being fast with the saw was considered a mark of skill. Patients were rarely given anesthesia, chloroform, and ether existed, but supplies were limited, and many doctors preferred to operate without it, believing speed was more important. This meant that soldiers were often fully awake, screaming, thrashing, and begging for mercy as their limbs were hacked off. Imagine lying there, surrounded by fellow soldiers waiting their turn, watching piles of severed arms and legs grow higher outside the tent. For many, the psychological trauma was as unbearable as the physical pain. In 19th century America, there was a cultural expectation called the good death. A man was supposed to die at home, surrounded by family, with time to confess his sins and say his final goodbyes. But in the Civil War, most soldiers died far from home, in muddy fields or makeshift hospitals, often in excruciating pain. Doctors couldn't save them, and chaplains couldn't reach everyone. Instead, the surgeon's tent became the place of death for thousands. Soldiers feared it so much that many begged their comrades to shoot them dead on the battlefield, rather than leave them to the sawbones. Letters from the time are filled with haunting lines like, "Pray, I am killed outright, for I dread the surgeon more than the enemy." But even more dangerous than bullets or saws was disease. Civil War camps were perfect breeding grounds for infection. Soldiers lived in crowded tents, often with poor sanitation. Latrines overflowed, food was contaminated, and clean water was rare. The result? Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid fever, malaria, smallpox, and pneumonia swept through the armies. For every soldier killed in battle, at least 2 died from disease. Doctors tried everything they could, but their treatments often made things worse. They used mercury-based medicines like calomel, which caused severe diarrhea, dehydration, and sometimes death. They bled patients with leeches, believing it would balance their humors. They dosed men with opium to dull pain, which led to widespread addiction. One soldier described camp life by saying, "We fear the surgeon's bottle more than the enemy's fire." Because medical science was so primitive, Civil War doctors often experimented on the fly. They tried new surgical techniques, unusual medications, and even bizarre home remedies. Some soldiers were treated with poultices made from mud, tobacco, or whiskey. Others were given concoctions of herbs that had no real effect. In desperate cases, doctors injected soldiers with experimental drugs that hadn't been tested. And because battlefield hospitals were overwhelmed, many soldiers received no treatment at all left to die in ditches, barns, or makeshift shelters. By the end of the war, the statistics were horrifying. 620,000 plus. Total deaths 2 out of 3 from disease or infection, 60,000 amputations. Tens of thousands left permanently disabled, disfigured, or addicted to morphine. Civil War medicine was a brutal turning point in history. It revealed just how unprepared doctors were for modern warfare, and how desperation led to practices we now see as barbaric. But here's the shocking part. As insane as it all sounds, these horrors actually laid the groundwork for modern medicine. The massive scale of suffering forced doctors to innovate, to learn, and to improve. The lessons of the Civil War would shape everything from battlefield triage to surgical training in the decades to come. And that's just the beginning. In the next part of this series, we'll dive deeper into the insane cures Civil War doctors believed in from mercury, and opium to bizarre folk remedies that sometimes killed patients faster than the disease itself. So, what do you think so far? Could you have survived a Civil War battlefield hospital? Or would you have rather taken your chances on the field? Let me know in the comments. I'll be reading them all. And don't forget, if you're fascinated by the darkest truths of history, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit like, and share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do. Stay tuned for part 2, because the madness is only getting started. Previously, we uncovered the terrifying world of Civil War battlefield surgery, where amputations were done in minutes, anesthesia was rare, and infection was more deadly than bullets. But battlefield tents were just one part of the horror. What doctors actually prescribed, the so-called cures, were often just as deadly as the wounds themselves. From mercury and opium to bizarre home remedies that sound more like witchcraft than medicine, the treatments soldiers endured were so insane, you'll wonder how anyone survived at all. Let us dive into the medical solutions of the Civil War, and why so many turned out to be deadly mistakes. If you walked into a Civil War hospital, chances are you'd see bottles of calomel lined up on the surgeon's table. Calomel, a compound made of mercury chloride, was considered a miracle cure at the time. Doctors believed it could purge the body of disease by triggering violent bowel movements. Here's how it worked. Patients were given large doses, which caused profuse diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration, and bleeding gums. Soldiers called it the blue mass because it often left their mouths stained bluish. The horrifying truth: mercury is toxic. Prolonged use led to neurological damage, rotting teeth, and in many cases death. But because Civil War doctors didn't understand germs or internal medicine, they thought calomel was working when patients flushed out their systems. In reality, it was poisoning them. One soldier described it grimly. "We were fighting the Rebs with rifles, but the doctors were fighting us with mercury." If calomel was the poison of choice, opium was the painkiller of the era. Doctors used opium in pills, powders, and liquid form, often mixed into laudanum, a cocktail of alcohol and opium. It dulled pain, calmed diarrhea, and helped soldiers sleep through fevers. For wounded men, morphine injections were sometimes the only relief from unbearable agony. But there was a dark side: addiction. Tens of thousands of Civil War veterans returned home hooked on morphine or opium. It became known as the soldier's disease. Doctors didn't recognize addiction as a medical condition, so veterans were left to suffer quietly with cravings, withdrawals, and ruined lives. Imagine surviving Gettysburg, only to spend the rest of your days enslaved to a bottle of laudanum. For many, that was the cruel aftermath of treatment. Not all Civil War medicine was deadly, though. One treatment actually worked: quinine. Malaria was rampant in swampy areas where armies camped, especially in the South. Soldiers were plagued by fever, chills, and exhaustion. Quinine, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree, was one of the few effective treatments. It reduced symptoms and sometimes saved lives. The problem? Supply shortages. Both the Union and Confederacy struggled to import enough quinine, and many soldiers went untreated. Desperate doctors tried substitutes like dogwood bark or even whiskey, but nothing worked as well. For every soldier saved by quinine, dozens more suffered because the war simply outpaced the medical supply chain. Even though it was the 1860s, many Civil War doctors still clung to ancient practices. Bloodletting, for example, was still used to balance the humors. Soldiers with fevers or infections might have their veins opened with a scalpel, losing pints of blood in hopes of draining out illness. Another favorite? Blistering. Doctors applied caustic chemicals or hot irons to a soldier's skin to raise painful blisters. The idea was that the body would draw disease to the surface and heal. In reality, these treatments weakened already fragile men, left them open to infection, and in many cases killed them faster. It was medicine rooted in medieval superstition rather than science. Alcohol flowed freely in Civil War hospitals. Whiskey and brandy were used as disinfectants, anesthetics, and tonics. Soldiers drank it for courage, pain relief, and sometimes simply to numb the horrors of war. Doctors often prescribed alcohol as medicine, believing it boosted strength and immunity. In reality, it dehydrated patients and masked symptoms without curing anything. But here is the twist. Alcohol sometimes worked better than mercury or bloodletting, if only because it didn't depoison patients as fast. Still, soldiers often left hospitals with addictions that haunted them long after the war. In the chaos of war, not every treatment came from a doctor's bag. Folk remedies passed down from soldiers' families were common. Some rubbed copper coins on wounds to draw out infection. Others drank concoctions of garlic, vinegar, and tobacco for fevers. Confederate soldiers, cut off from medical supplies, even brewed teas from wild plants as substitutes for quinine. Desperate times led to desperate measures. Some remedies may have offered comfort, but most did little more than give soldiers hope in a hopeless situation. Field hospitals were often nothing more than barns, churches, or abandoned homes. The smell of rotting flesh, human waste, and unwashed bodies was overwhelming. Flies swarmed everywhere, spreading infection from one patient to the next. Doctors rarely washed their hands, and surgical instruments were caked with dried blood. Gangrene spread quickly, turning wounds black and foul-smelling. Amputated limbs were tossed in piles outside, attracting rats and dogs. Soldiers who survived surgery often died days later from sepsis. One Union nurse described it like this: "The floor was slippery with blood. The groans of the dying echoed as the surgeons worked, one patient after another. The smell was beyond description: death, disease, and despair in every breath." It's no wonder that soldiers often said, "If you want to die, go to the hospital." While battlefield medicine was gruesome, the real killers were the camps. Dysentery killed more soldiers than bullets. Men called it the bloody flux. Typhoid fever spread through contaminated water. Smallpox outbreaks ravaged units, often unchecked. Pneumonia thrived in damp, cold tents. Doctors struggled to control outbreaks, but sanitation was nearly non-existent. Latrines overflowed into drinking water, and garbage piled up. One Confederate soldier wrote home, "The stench of camp is worse than any battlefield. Men fall ill by the dozens, and we bury them faster than we can fight." In this nightmare, one group quietly changed everything: nurses. Thousands of women, including famous figures like Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix, volunteered as nurses. They cleaned wounds, comforted the dying, and fought to improve sanitation. Unlike many surgeons, nurses insisted on washing bedding, oiling water, and cleaning wounds. These simple steps saved countless lives. Clara Barton later founded the American Red Cross, inspired by what she witnessed in the war. Nurses may not have had medical degrees, but their common-sense care was often more effective than the doctor's insane cures. By the end of the Civil War, 2/3 of soldiers died from disease or medical treatment, not combat. Addiction and poisoning crippled veterans for decades. Hospitals killed almost as many as they saved. But here's the shocking truth. As barbaric as it all was, Civil War medicine forced doctors to confront their failures. Out of this chaos came the first real push towards sanitary reform, medical training, and the eventual acceptance of germ theory. Civil War medicine was insane, but also transformative. Every amputation, every mercury pill, every laudanum overdose taught doctors something, even if it came at a terrible cost. But what happened after the war may be even more shocking. Veterans carried the scars, addictions, and disabilities of this insane medicine for the rest of their lives. Many formed the first organized veteran groups in America, not just to honor their service, but to demand care. And in Part 3, we'll uncover how the Civil War's insane medical practices shaped the future of American medicine. From the birth of modern hospitals to the rise of prosthetic industries, the legacy of these horrors still impacts us today. Question for you. If you were a soldier in 1863, would you risk going to the surgeon's tent or take your chances untreated? Comment below. I'd love to hear your answer. And don't forget, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss Part 3. The story I listened to over the consequences of these insane treatments are still with us today. We've already seen the chaos of Civil War surgery tents, where amputations were done with dirty saws, and the so-called cures were often more deadly than the wounds. But what happened after the war was just as shocking. Hundreds of thousands of veterans went home, carrying the scars of battlefield medicine. Some had missing limbs, others lifelong addictions, and many never escaped the psychological trauma of what they endured. This wasn't just a medical disaster, it was the foundation of modern American medicine. So how did the insane practices of Civil War doctors leave a legacy that still affects us today? Let's find out. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States faced a medical crisis unlike anything it had ever seen. Out of roughly 620,000 deaths, 2/3 were from disease and treatment complications, not battle. Over 400,000 soldiers returned home permanently disabled. many missing arms or legs. Tens of thousands were addicted to morphine, victims of the so-called soldier's disease. The war created the largest population of disabled veterans America had ever seen. Communities suddenly had to adapt to men who couldn't farm, couldn't work the same jobs, and often couldn't even care for themselves. Families bore the burden. Wives and children became caregivers, and entire towns were transformed by the sight of maimed men walking their streets. With so many amputees, demand for prosthetic limbs skyrocketed. Before the war, prosthetics were rare, expensive, and crude. After the war, they became a booming industry. The U.S. government began offering financial aid for veterans to purchase artificial limbs. Companies like J.E. Hanger's firm, founded by a Confederate soldier who lost his leg at the Battle of Philippi, pioneered more functional designs. By the 1870s, prosthetics had evolved from wooden pegs to articulated joints with springs and hinges. This was one of the rare positive legacies of the war. Out of tragedy came innovation. But for many veterans, prosthetics were uncomfortable and painful, constant reminders of the horrors they'd endured. The widespread use of morphine and opium during the war created a hidden epidemic. Thousands of veterans returned home dependent on painkillers, long before doctors understood addiction. These men were often stigmatized, accused of weakness or moral failing, when in reality, they had been given addictive drugs by their own doctors. The Civil War may have been America's first true opioid crisis, a tragic foreshadowing of the struggles the country still faces today with prescription drug addiction. Not all wounds were visible. Veterans carried deep psychological scars from both combat and medical treatment. Soldiers described endless nightmares of surgery tents, screams of amputees, and the smell of rotting flesh. Many became withdrawn, anxious, or violent, what was then called soldier's heart or irritable heart. Today, we recognize this as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but at the time, it was misunderstood, often dismissed as weakness. Doctors of the 1860s had no framework for mental health. Men who couldn't cope were often abandoned, institutionalized, or left to self-medicate with alcohol and opium. The war didn't just scar bodies, it broke minds. One of the surprising outcomes of the Civil War was the transformation of American hospitals. Before the war, hospitals were small, local, and often mistrusted. Most people preferred home care. But the sheer scale of wartime medical needs forced the rapid expansion of organized hospitals. The Union Army built large, well-structured hospitals with specialized wards, record-keeping, and sanitation standards. Many of these innovations carried over into civilian life after the war. Hospitals became more professionalized, with trained nurses, surgeons, and eventually medical schools adopting stricter standards. In other words, Civil War medicine was barbaric, but it forced America to modernize healthcare. Before the war, many doctors had little formal training. Some had only a few months of apprenticeship. The failures of wartime medicine revealed just how unprepared they were. After 1865, medical schools began expanding curricula, emphasizing anatomy, pathology, and eventually bacteriology. By the 1870s and 1880s, germ theory gained traction, thanks to scientists like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister. Within a generation, antiseptic surgery, hand washing, and sterilization became standard. The war's horrors accelerated this shift. Doctors could no longer ignore the link between sanitation and survival. The Civil War also exposed how deadly poor sanitation could be. Camps overrun by dysentery, typhoid, and cholera showed the government that disease could devastate armies as much as enemy bullets. This realization helped spark the beginnings of public health reforms. Cities slowly invested in sewage systems and clean water supplies. Health boards were established to monitor outbreaks. The U.S. Sanitary Commission, born during the war, evolved into a broader movement for health reform. Though progress was uneven, the seeds of modern public health were planted in those filthy camps. Clara Barton, who earned the nickname the Angel of the Battlefield, was deeply changed by what she saw. After the war, she founded the American Red Cross, bringing organized disaster relief and medical aid to the nation. Her legacy was directly tied to the failures she witnessed during the war: the lack of supplies, the chaos of field hospitals, and the suffering of neglected soldiers. Without the Civil War, the Red Cross might never have existed in the U.S. With so many disabled and traumatized veterans, the federal government faced immense pressure to provide support. Pension systems expanded, offering financial aid to injured soldiers. Soldiers' homes and asylums were established, though conditions were often poor. Advocacy groups formed, demanding better treatment for veterans, planting the seeds of what would later become the Veterans Administration, VAGA. For the first time, America grappled with the long-term responsibility of caring for those who sacrificed in war. The Civil War exposed the darkest side of medicine: barbaric amputations, poisonous treatments, and the ignorance of doctors who meant well, but often killed their patients. But it also pushed the nation forward. Hospitals became professional. Nursing became respected. Prosthetics advanced rapidly. Public health gained importance. The war was a crucible of suffering, but from its flames emerged the foundation of modern American medicine. So, what's the twisted legacy of Civil War doctors? They were both butchers and pioneersmen who hacked limbs without anesthesia, but also laid the groundwork for antiseptic surgery. They poisoned soldiers with mercury, yet stumbled toward scientific progress. The Civil War medical system was insane, cruel, and deadly, but it forced America to confront the cost of ignorance. And maybe that's the ultimate irony. Out of the blood-soaked tents and piles of amputated limbs came the first real steps toward saving lives instead of destroying them. Now let me ask you, if you had been a soldier in 1863, would you have trusted the doctors or taken your chances untreated? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them. And if you found this deep dive eye-opening, hit that subscribe button, tap the bell, and share this video. Because history's darkest truths are worth remembering, and we've got plenty more insane stories to uncover together.